record for this. And
this meeting is being recorded.
Welcome you all to this second session of our Whiteness and Embodied Antiracism series. We're so glad to have Ellie and Kevin back for round two, and excited to see what we learned today. So I'll hand it over right away to you, Ellie and Kevin, and take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. It's really good to see your faces already are familiar after being together last month. So thank you for coming back. We never know. There could have been no one who decided to join us again. So I appreciate you. And I know how busy life is. So thank you for taking the time. I would love if you remember to start how we started last session with a one-word check-in. And so we all have busy lives. We're hustling from one place to the next. So I just want to acknowledge the energy that we're bringing from our last place, to this Zoom community at this moment. So I'll invite you to take any movement that you'd like to take, maybe a shoulder roll or two, maybe a little stretch. And then whenever you're ready, I'll invite you to blink your eyes closed. Or take a soft gaze and invite your awareness to drop from your mind down into your body. Turn toward your body with curiosity and reverence. Take a few cleansing breaths. And notice how our breath invites us to be in this place, in this moment, as it arises. Allow the rest of the day, whatever it took for you to get here, to fade away, to fade out of focus. We can pick it up later if we need to. Notice how your body is feeling. Notice places in your body where you might sense some heaviness, constriction, tightness. Notice where in your body you may sense some expansion, some spaciousness, some lightness. And then we're never just one thing, but notice what is taking up a lot of space, maybe what is rising to this surface. We'll attach one word to how we're feeling, to the energy that we're bringing into community with us. On your next inhale, fill your lungs all the way up, more than usual. Exhale really slowly, take your time. When you reach the bottom of your exhale, blink your eyes back open. Come on back to the shared space. Okay, I would love if you'd be willing to, in the chat, put your one-word check-in so Kevin and I can get a sense of how you are feeling, the kind of collective energy that the group has today. Curious, relief, right, intrigued, grounded, overstimulated, open, scattered, intrigued, open, hungry, curious, but personally stressed. Thank you. Really appreciate that. Empty. Thanks, Amy. Okay. Let's begin with some breathing, and then we'll shift our attention toward what Kevin has to offer the group. So again, remember, when I say move, I'm going to invite us to move how a young child wakes up from a nap, or how a pet wakes up from a nap. Move without intuition or self-consciousness. Just kind of move how your body wants to move. Zoom can be so hard on our bodies. So maybe take a couple of shoulder rolls, maybe a side stretch or two, as just a way to continue to acknowledge that we have bodies, that our bodies have needs, that our bodies are always communicating to us. And it is our choice whether we listen and respond or not. And then there's no need to rush, but whenever you're ready to move toward stillness, I'll invite you to do so. You can always do the seated or standing. If you're seated, uncross your legs, stack your shoulders over your hips. Reach the crown of your head up toward the ceiling on an inhale. And on an exhale, gently ground down through your sitting bones, through the soles of your feet. Maybe pull the chin back toward your throat a ½ inch and feel how the back of your neck elongates. Reach your bottom ribs away from the top of your pelvis, extending your torso. Allow your shoulders to drop away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Pull your tongue away from the roof of your mouth. And then notice that you're breathing. Notice your inhales and exhales. And then we'll move toward a 3 count inhale with an open mouth exhale. So let's meet at the bottom of an exhale. Inhale 1/3 and hold. Inhale 2/3 and hold. Inhale 3/3 and hold. Open mouth exhale. Inhale 1/3. 2/3. 3/3. Open mouth exhale. One more. Inhale 1/3. Inhale 2/3. Inhale 3/3. Open mouth exhale. Return to your natural breath. Notice how your body is feeling. Remove any effort from your breath. Allow your body to be breathed. And at the bottom of your next exhale, blink your eyes back open and come back to the space. Thank you. Okay, Kevin, what do you have for us today?
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here. I'm Kevin Lally. I'm a high school teacher, and I do DEI work around whiteness and anti-racism. So last session, we talked a little bit about some constructs, some ways that we would propose the better ways of understanding how whiteness and white supremacy operate. So I'll review those in a moment. I want to give a few of the same kind of contextual elements of how I started last time, just to name them again. First of all, I want to name that a lot of the work, anti-racist work, is developed by and kind of built on the shoulders of Black and Brown scholars, particularly women. That the work I'll be sharing has its roots in that scholarship. And I'll additionally be sharing a little bit of my own research. The other thing I want to name and be clear about, well, two other things. One is that I don't assume that this is new information. I don't assume that I'm presenting something to you that is familiar, or that if you have never been exposed to it, that doesn't it doesn't mean really anything in terms of who you are as a person. I think there's a belief or a stereotype maybe that the more we know about anti-racism, the more anti-racist we are. And part of our work is to try to dispel that and change our understanding of how those things operate. So that's one major caveat. The second is the work I'm going to be sharing, the bulk of the work I'm going to be sharing with you today is about the origins of whiteness, the origins of white supremacy. And the perspective I'm going to be taking is of how white people, or people who became whites, experience this initial wound of becoming white. That wound is now at the heart of white supremacy in different ways that I'll talk about. But I want to be very clear that that woundedness that white people experienced is not comparable to the wounds experienced by BIPOC folks. Those are not the same thing. And in order for us to better understand the structures that undergird contemporary white supremacy and racism, I believe we have to understand the mechanisms that informed that behavior and those belief systems. And scholars have located a number of those in these historical elements that I'll be talking about. So I'm going to start by opening a slide to talk a little bit about some review. These are some reminders of what we talked about last time, that racism and white supremacy adapt. They don't just go away on their own. There are mythologies of whiteness, mythologies of America, that remain insidious, pervasive, damaging, dangerous, that it's important for us to talk about. Those include things like this inevitability of social progress, that we are moving in the direction of progress regardless of our behaviors. We just need to wait for all of the racist people to die out or something like that. But that's a myth that goes all the way back, in fact. The myth of that everything's neutral now, that racism is in the past, and the myth that racism is rooted in racial animosity, that racism is a problem of people who kind of are explicit racists, the Proud Boys, depending on your perspective, the MAGA people, those people are the root of racism, rather than racism being structurally and institutionally located and oriented. That we're shifting toward a racial literacy, understanding terminology, language, vocabulary, and sharing and understanding untold stories, rather than this belief that we just, so long as we're all just spending more time together, being more open-minded, that these problems will just sort of go away. And as we talked about last time, that our encounter with the dominant groups, white groups, encounters with racial others is often an empathetic encounter that sidesteps or can avoid the power dynamics inherent in those relationships. So we talked about this need for people from dominant groups, in our case racially, for white people to encounter racial others without an acknowledgement that race is always already orienting us toward each other and toward ourselves. We're not choosing to engage with racism or white supremacy. We are always already engaged with these things. And we need to recognize that to better inform the ways that we interact with other people. And then finally, that we're stuck. White folks are stuck within whiteness. And we're stuck as liberal white people. We're stuck as conservative white people. And our work is not to go out and fix other people. The work of white people is to fix whiteness and white people themselves. So I'm going to take myself off of the thing here. And just sort of story tell a little bit for our first section. I want to note that I did share slides that cover some of this information for the first section, so you'll have access to those in addition to the recording of this. But I'm going to talk about two historical eras that gave shape to whiteness and white supremacy. So last time we mentioned that whiteness hurts and wounds white people first. These are two ways that those wounds happened. So the first is in 1600s Virginia, and the context is on tobacco plantations where they were, it was early 1600s, the conditions were horrifying. There were very few people who were in charge, and they were desperately bringing in forced labor, essentially, from Northern Europe, especially England, and a little bit later from Africa. So enslaved people from Africa were working alongside European laborers who, if they weren't enslaved, their circumstances weren't all that different. In that their circumstances, they confronted a 50% mortality rate the first year anyone showed up because the conditions were so difficult. That they, many of them didn't survive, much longer than that. And that there wasn't an established social structure other than there were the people who owned the plantations and the laborers. The way the laborers, African and European, interacted and noticed differences were not racial, because race wasn't a thing at this point. The differences were religious, language, there were lingual differences, and cultural differences. So the differences between these two groups they noticed skin color, obviously, but the primary differences were different. They were not skin color. And that over time, like as we move into the mid 1600s, these groups interacted. They got together, rose up against the establishment at the time as a united class, and almost won. And the result was the people in charge worked to divide that group any way they could. And the most efficient way they could was by race. They couldn't quite divide by religion anymore. They couldn't divide by language anymore. So they divided people by race. And they set up a series of very explicit laws that took property from people who were becoming Black, from African laborers, gave it to poor white laborers. They armed poor white laborers and told them that they were now in charge of the folks who had been their compatriots, really these African laborers, so that over time, the mechanism of power was to empower one group over another so that they would not align themselves together anymore. And that divide was a wound. That divide essentially broke an authentic class solidarity and an authentic social solidarity in favor of a false sense of racial superiority and a false sense of kinship with the owners, with the people they had been revolting against. And that's an initial wound of whiteness. And we can recognize that dynamic at work still, and we can recognize it because it needs maintenance. The racial divide is not a natural way of being. So periodically, politicians, other people with power will try to essentially scapegoat either Black laborers, later immigrants, so that the wage earning people who are becoming white would not be angry at their bosses. They would be angry at the folks who would naturally be the people they would have solidarity with.
Yes.
So that scapegoating was the initial mechanism of whiteness. That's wound number one. The next one is is about masking. So I am going to bring a slide back up here, and thanks to Ellie. Do please put comments or questions in the chat. The content here is it's intense, and it's not necessarily self-evident. The second part gets a little complicated, but our hope is that it helps make sense of a lot of the dynamics that are at play today. So I'll share my screen again here. So the first racial contract, surrender a genuine class affinity for a tenuous alignment and a false sense of superiority. And that's the early to mid 1600s. The second, it comes with these waves of European immigrants in the 1800s. So what was the process by which these immigrants went from being European to being white? And we know a part of that history. And we're going to delve into another dynamic of it that's a little more social emotional. One kind of key line here, one way of thinking about this is a quote from Toni Morrison. The subject of the dream is the dreamer, by which she meant that white understandings of BIPOC folks are often about white people. That racial others in the white imagination are projections of white anxieties, of white longing, of white fear, of white anger. So I'm going to talk about the ways that that becomes baked into whiteness in the 1800s. So first, in the same way that we needed to know the historical context of the 1600s, whereby race hadn't been yet a thing, before these waves of European immigrants, when the founding fathers and all these folks were around, there was even then an anxiety among the people who were coming to become American about who they were. They weren't British anymore, but they weren't yet American. So the identity they took up in the form of protest was Indianness or indigeneity. So this idea of what's so-called white Indian protests, the most famous example is the Boston Tea Party, but this happened throughout New England, that protest people who are European immigrants becoming American, second generation, third generation, they wanted to establish themselves, so they put on a mask of Indianness to claim an authentic relationship with this new place. Say, we're no longer British, we're American, and this is what it means to be American. So that masking, even before these waves of European immigrants, masking was one way by which whiteness understood itself. So as I mentioned, white Indian protests. The process of becoming white was an act of suppression. It was an act of getting rid of ethnic identity. And I want to name a couple of the things that we got rid of in the process. The white folks, people who became white, had to dispel in order to become white, because that's the second loss. So there were these holidays, Pinkster as another word for Pentecost, or Black Election Day. These urban and rural groups would get together. This quote from whiteness scholar David Roediger: they would mix in the cities under Black leadership. These were carnivals. There was dancing, singing, feasts, performances. There are accounts of people who are becoming white being audiences for and giving money to people who are becoming Black, free and enslaved, performing, and then white people paying them for it. So doing dances, doing skits, singing songs, and that this was this really, I mean, it was messy. Is really, as history tells us, was messy more than like this beautiful interracial union. But in terms of how we understand the world, this was this coming together of, it was a cross-racial class coming together. It was this in the same way that happened in the 1600s. Folks were unifying, they were coming together, finding this cross-cultural exchange and interracial solidarity. This was threatening to the people in charge in the same way that it was threatening to the owning class in the 1600s, so that the process, they essentially, they shut that down. They sanctioned in very limited ways how the people who were becoming white could interact with Blackness, because there was this desire to be close. There was a natural inclination for folks to mingle and mix and learn about each other. I mean, that's our natural state of being. So it takes work to divide that. So in the process of folks, these people, these Europeans becoming white, they have to give up all these different elements of who they are, including interracial solidarity. But the wound, we're familiar, I think, with this element of the wounds. Like our European immigrants often have stories about their last names being different. We have a limited set of sanctioned holidays, one of which is tomorrow, based on whatever ethnic group held sort of political sway at the time. The only reason we celebrate Columbus Day was because one political party wanted the Italian vote. So they said, we'll celebrate Columbus, he's your guy, right? So now we have Columbus Day. We have St. Patrick's Day because of the strength of the Irish voting bloc. And essentially, we funneled all of these celebrations into very specific single days. In the same way we funnel Black history into a month, in the same way we funnel union solidarity and worker collectivity into a single day that we don't even really like. May Day is meant to be this collective workers' day, but even that's been changed as a way to keep people sort of compliant and behaving and doing their jobs. The other elements of humanity that were given up by these ethnic groups were their exuberance, their loudness, their joy, being wild and crazy, having these carnivals that would last for days, drunkenness, these skits that would mock the elites. These, in some ways, we can think of these as like the old world, like European festivals that would go on. Like the Renaissance festival is meant to be like a kind of image of that, where you eat a lot, you drink a lot, you laugh at the power structures. That all was needed to be given up. It became sanctioned, and that the ways that people could interact with those things was when it was masked. So we move essentially, let me get to this in a moment. European groups gain enfranchisement, they get the vote, they get access to jobs, they get access to certain areas of housing, they get access to economic advancement by taking up whiteness. And as we know, whiteness was not on offer to everyone, but there was a time when who was white was a lot less clear than it is now. There are accounts of Irish dock workers, like longshoremen, protesting to keep the docks white and excluding German dock workers. So the Irish were trying to appeal to a racial prejudice against Germans because they thought that the Germans weren't white and they as Irish were. So whiteness has this very mutable, contested history. And we don't have time to get into it, but it's essentially, it's, as we can imagine, it's this made up category. But to gain access to it, a person had to behave, they had to give up certain things. They had to behave certain ways. And that is a loss. It's the second wound of white supremacy that is inflicted upon white bodies, so that white bodies will then enforce this unnatural divide, this unnatural racial divide. So the ways that these European immigrants could express some of these very authentic human feelings like joy, like exuberance, like mockery, like homesickness, was by masking. So in the same way that white people in the 1700s protested in masks as Indians, That was the way they were able to express that while remaining respectable citizens. There was no question about who the protesters were, by the way. It was not a disguise. It was a mask, these are not the same things, right? It's not meant to hide your identity. It's a way to take up a different identity. Whiteness, because whiteness suppresses all these things, we can only encounter them through masks, as costumes for what we call serious play. So in the same way that macho, hyper-masculine men might have a great deal of fun with a drag show, while homophobic men might have a great deal of fun with drag and kind of playing with those tensions, but only in a certain context, in a drag context. The ways for a suppressed human being to gain access to, even for a temporary amount of time, authentic aspects of themselves is by twisting it, that it comes out as a kind of perversion, a kind of sickness, and that's blackface. There are accounts of Irish immigrants coming to, like in New England, watching Irish performers perform songs about Ireland in blackface. The blackface made it so that it wasn't anti-patriotic, it wasn't anti-American. It was a mask so that they could articulate their homesickness while still taking up an American and a white way of being. Over time, then, that shifts. It changes into, I'm not missing Ireland, I'm missing the South. I'm missing slavery. So lost ways of being, the agrarian lifestyle, the more carefree lifestyle, the resistance, hating my boss, not going to work, complaining about capitalism, complaining about corporate whatever, that becomes masked as blackface. Because Black people did not have access to whiteness. So by masking themselves, these European becoming white immigrants were given permission to articulate those things. At the same time, it was a racial divide, that the racial divide was sustained by the mockery, the ridicule, the endorsement of slavery. That was often hand in hand when it came to these blackface performances. So that blackface, we recognize today the racism inherent in blackface. What we lose in what's as or even more important, I'm going to take myself off of the screen here. I'm going to show one more slide. What we lose is that there's an authentic longing at the root of a lot of these racial and racist expressions. So as an example, this is Peter from Ohio. You might recognize him as one of the Unite the Right marchers, these guys who chanted racist things, anti-Semitic things, unquestionably. They caught up with this guy from his, I'm sure he was like an insurance adjuster or some normal job in Ohio. And he said, I hope that the people sharing the photo are willing to listen, that I'm not the angry racist they see in that photo. White nationalists aren't all hateful. We just want to preserve what we have. So that ultimately it comes down to a lack of authentic ways of being. The wounds of whiteness strip away from white people the options to be resistant, to be cavalier, to be loud, to be exuberant, to be irreverent. Those aren't acceptable ways of being within, I mean, originally WASPy, but as it expands, that's the way to be. And it's not that we white people suddenly stop desiring those things. And that longing is a genuine, authentic, human thing that needs to be addressed if we're to address white supremacy and racism. As Resmaa Menakem says, we will not end white body supremacy or any other form of human evil by trying to tear it to pieces. Instead, we can offer people better ways to belong and better things to belong to. The problem is not, we can't imagine that we're here to stamp out racism. We're here to try to really initially address and try to fix white woundedness. So white people no longer do all this work to sustain an artificial divide. All right, I'm going to pause there. That's quite a bit of content. So I think I'm going to just take a moment. I'm going to invite us to take a breath, invite any questions or comments to pop up in the chat, and then we'll do some embodiment to get out of our heads and try to process or recognize some of the things we're feeling, and then we'll do a second round. So I'm going to take a deep breath here. Are there any thoughts, questions, resonances that anyone would want to share for the good of the group in this moment?
I'll just say, I feel as though you're taking all these things that I know, but you're shuffling the whole deck and arranging them in a different way. So I'm just like very quickly like reorganizing everything in my head. And it's not like I didn't suspect these things, but they're just ending up next to different things. Does that make sense?
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think that's the power, well, the potential in what we call racial literacy. It's not that we've been totally backwards. Our approach is off. And if we adjust our approach, all of these other pieces can fall into place. That blackface operates like that, I think, makes more sense than just like, well, what's it about exactly? And when we can recognize that woundedness, like, oh, okay. And then our work becomes more clear. Not easier, but more clear. Yeah, Amy, thank you.
Kevin, I had a question about your comment about whiteness, stripping, revelry, resistance, revolt. So I'm in the same corner of Minnesota that Jesse is in. And it is no secret that this area is very kind of German Catholic stoic. I've heard the phrase anal retentive used quite often. Sorry, I don't know how inappropriate that is, but what is the difference between whiteness as a phenomenon, stripping, revelry, resistance, revolts, and characteristics of a culture that my understanding is there was a German stoicism that was brought over? So it's not so much that whiteness like stripped the revelry, but it seems like the culture of one ethnic group became a dominant culture. What's the difference there, I guess, just kind of taking your comments and applying it to this specific context?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, there is not a fine line whereby we just go from one to the other. So two thoughts, and they're not totally fully formed, but we'll just offer them. One is that there are I think about Oktoberfest. So there are elements of German culture that are very revelry oriented, and that Stoicism is certainly a part of it. I mean, Lutherans. Just Lutherans. So there are those elements culturally that do go back a ways. Protestants as well, and I'm thinking of like the Mayflower people as opposed to the Virginia colony. So there are some like deeply embedded cultural roots that we can see echoes of today that align with the structures of whiteness. I think the other shift is like, for whom or for what are we being stoic? What's the underlying function of the stoicism? And there are kind of other psychologies laid on top of that. So in addition to I have to behave a certain way, one of my emotional outlets is racial scapegoating. That's not, I mean, it's not a specific German thing. In a way, it's a culture, it's a universal cultural thing like that. Everyone does some of that. But the intent focus of whiteness to scapegoat racial others as a way to preserve the folks in charge, I think when that's overlaid on that stoicism, you've got the stoic Trump voters. That's also an imperfect alignment there, but it's yeah. My initial thought is that it is about the function of that stoicism, who is being served by it. The stoicism of whiteness is about subservience, and the stoicism. I'm not. I guess I don't know enough. I'm not sure. I think the stoicism of being German or being Lutheran is its sort of own value. It's a value maybe of. I think of it as a kind of patriarchal value, and those are also tied up together. That's an imperfect answer, but that's sort of my initial stab at that.
Yeah, thanks. That actually, like as on the, sorry, let me back up a little bit. I was invited through the Collegeville Institute, which is like an ecumenical institute. And so kind of, I think that you made a really interesting comment about talking about like the Mayflower, the Virginia colonies, or even the flavor of Christianity here in the Midwest, and wondering what things in each of those areas might have contributed to this kind of stoicism. And I don't know if like Claire or Connor have anything to say, but you are like one of the leading areas in like Puritan research in North America, Regent colleges, and there certainly is a flavor of German stoicism that is like part of the like Protestant prayer history that gets brought to this. So anyway, all that to say, you are bringing up a lot of questions in my head now about like how specific spiritual traditions map onto this like larger phenomenon of whiteness, that I'm like, I don't know, like, is it, can we blame everything on the Puritans? That's more scapegoating, which is not there, and this is what we're avoiding in this meeting. But you bring up some really interesting things I'll have to think on for a while. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. There are wonderful scholars who have done historical work specifically about that area and whiteness. So I get into that a little bit in chapter 2 of my book, not very much, but that was one of the resources I shared. And within that chapter, I talk about scholars who have done research about that. Ellie, can I hand it to you for a break? Should we take a break, or should we go ahead into the next set?
I'll just do a quick addition as well. With St. Patrick's Day tomorrow, my family's very Irish, and this is one of the times whiteness always comes up for me. My children are endlessly interested in the fact that we're Irish. My 8-year-old made a little poster he was researching traditional Irish instruments and drawing them on his little Irish poster. But I've always feel totally ill-equipped to celebrate, like my youngest just thinks we get to eat green candy tomorrow and is so excited for that. And that feels so shallow and empty to me, that I know part of my work is to continue to explore my family tree and to explore some of those cultural celebrations that at some point we lost along the way. So St. Patrick's Day being such an American Irish celebration. But my kids really wanting to be from somewhere, knowing where their ancestors are from, like that is a deep longing in them that I'm trying to hold space for and cultivate. All right. Let me take my parka off and we'll move the bodies. The room I'm in is so cold. I'm going to invite us just to stand up. We're going to move with our breath very quickly, and then we'll let Kevin tell us some more smart things. If you want to pop your camera off, feel free to do so. We're just going to do a little bit of breathing and twisting. Sometimes we'll twist our body, but we very rarely hold it, and it can feel really, really good to rinse. So I'm going to have you to stand up. Take any movement you want. We've been sitting for a while. If you want to do a nice full body stretch or a shoulder roll or two. And then whenever you're ready, we're going to place our feet hip distance apart, maybe even a little bit more, and start with your hands out in front of you. Swing your left arm down and look left. So your hips are facing forward, your knees are facing forward, but you're twisting through your ribs. Pull the back of your hands back, extend through all 10 fingertips, and then reach the crown of your head up to the ceiling. Maybe look over that left shoulder. And then come back to neutral. Notice how your body feels at neutral. Drop the right hand down, look right. Keep your knees and hips facing forward. Twist through the ribs, pull the back of your hand back. Reach through all 10 fingertips. Reach the crown of your head up toward the ceiling. Maybe look over your right shoulder. And swing back. Let's do that one more time. Inhale. Exhale, twist. Stay for a breath. Inhale. Exhale, twist a little bit deeper. Come back to center. Inhale. Exhale, twist right. Stay for a breath. Inhale. Exhale, twist a little deeper. Come back to center. And then drop your arms. Shake that out. Feel if any energy was released in that twist. And then take any movement that you'd like on your way back to your spots. All right, we're good and rinsed, Kev. We're ready to go.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to shift and talk a little bit about my own research. So a quick overview. I've been a high school English teacher for a long time. And I did for a number of years, I tried to get at anti-racist pedagogy. What I often found was, I think what a lot of folks find when we have conversations about racism among white people, which is that we divided quickly into two camps. This is also for everyone in the room in my classroom. They were used to this. This seemed like a very common occurrence. One camp was racism is a problem, white privilege is a thing, we need to do something about it. The other camp was racism was a problem a long time ago. Why is this my thing? I didn't own slaves. Haven't we come so far? You know, Obama's president, et cetera. These kind of post-racial ideologies. And we would just talk to each other. Sometimes we'd argue. Sometimes feelings would get high. Not infrequently, and unfortunately, a person of color often had an emotional experience where they would articulate something painful. All of the white kids would be like, "Oh, I didn't know. Ouch! You know, shoot." And there was white growth on a BIPOC person's pain. That was also not an uncommon experience. But this structure was unhelpful, was unproductive, ungenerative. So I went to PhD school to try to like figure that out. And I went in to be like, all right, give me the books, give me the curriculum. I'm going to solve this. That, you know, white man, I'll fix that. And of course it didn't work. And when I did my own research, I tried to recreate that dynamic. So I enrolled students in a study, and I tried to enroll more conservative-minded kids and more liberal-minded kids. I ended up by kind of a fluke with only liberal-minded kids, with one exception, although he didn't really participate. But what happened was that I came across all of these dynamics among liberal students. And in doing research and supplemental work and working with my mentor, Tim Lensmeyer, who's done a lot of great work around this stuff, it came clear to me that the problem, and as other folks say, the problem is not racists and anti-racists. The problem is really, at least in my work, good, non-racist white people, which was me. So I'm going to share some quotes, first of all, from these kids. The first is going to characterize just their general experience of what it was, what their education was like. And I think this covers like the last 40 years of education. So my thinking is that this would resonate with folks. So I'm just going to read this out loud. In elementary school, when you first learn about race, you learn about MLK and other civil rights people. You're automatically assumed you're not racist, and that's that. There's no education about what race is. So you're saying, okay, good, you're in 2019. Of course, this is when I'm doing this research. And you're not racist. Now go out into the world. You have no idea about racism or about race and have no handle on how to go about it. Which is to say, the way we've been doing this isn't working. Everybody knows that racism is a problem, or at least we know that that's a thing that people say that has not moved anyone to action. And then this pattern, they described this pattern where in elementary school they would encounter racism from a teacher who would, with the best of intentions, would try to impart upon them the horrors of racism by depicting often violence against Black bodies. And you can imagine the harm done by that. So these white kids, especially these liberal-minded white kids, are just being hammered by this. Like, oh my God, I get it. Okay, like, what am I supposed to do? I feel terrible about this. And other kids are resisting that. And their resistance became this object of my teaching before, right? I'm going to fix their resistance. So I have a quote from my one student who was more conservative-minded, who didn't end up participating. And here's what he said. This is also deeply resonated with me. When people talk about all this crap that's gone down, you can hear the anger in his voice. And like with the Civil War, I'm kind of wondering, what the hell do you expect me to feel or do about it? Like, yeah, it was tragic, but that was 150 years ago and my family wasn't even here. So you can't even guilt me into the old white plantation thing. I literally had nothing to do with this. And you're going to blame me because of my skin color and expect me to feel bad about it. Now, he could have been talking about my own pedagogy. I had taught him the year before. And his anger, in a way, is understandable. He's spent most of his education as a white person. Anytime he encounters racism in the classroom, that's the message he's getting. And he's a little bit like, stop. Like, what do you want? What do you want me to do? And what I realized was I hadn't told them what to do. Right? It's a fair question. What do you want me to do about it? Like, oh, I mean, I ought to have an answer. And I didn't. I was so focused on trying to convert these kids with an almost evangelical zeal that I lost track of what I was ultimately trying to do, which is, you know, like change behavior. Or I thought that this was a hearts and minds situation. If I go out and convince other white people that racism is a problem, then somehow everything will be good. We'll all vote for the right person. You know, I'm a good lower D Democrat. I will vote. Without recognizing that that's not how this works, right? The way we talked last time about non-racism. It's not about racist, it's about non-racism. It's about my own self-interest. And how my own self-interest perpetuates the status quo. It perpetuates the same system that has been sustaining and generating racial divides for the past 400 years. And these white kids, these liberal white kids, share these very interesting comments. This is from one. This is Ben's, the same kid I quoted last time. For the longest time, I didn't have the vocabulary to talk about that stuff, you know, race talk, as we call it. And then so I didn't. So I didn't have the vocabulary, so I felt ashamed about that. So I didn't contribute. And I didn't contribute, so I felt ashamed about that. And I didn't contribute again, which is a positive feedback loop. And what he's getting at is this sense that shared with by a lot of these kids, these liberal-minded kids, that they had always already failed when it came to anti-racism. At 17, they had always already failed. It wasn't that I had all these opportunities. I mean, I guess it was in a way. They think I didn't interject in that one moment where that kid said the thing. Or this came up a lot. Somebody'd say, this movie, Avatar, it's super problematic. It's the colonial story. It's, you know, it's racist in these ways. And they're like, oh my God, I didn't even see that. What's wrong with me? As though not being able to locate every instance of racism is as bad as committing racism itself, whatever that phrase means. But you see what I'm getting at? These liberal-minded white kids, and I would argue liberal-minded people in general, are stuck in this guilt and this shame that more conservative-minded white people reject out of hand. And they often reject it with anger. I'm going to skip this just in the interest of time. They also articulated a number of binds, ways that they were utterly caught, a stuckness that from which they could not escape. We can't be positive that an anti-racism action is justified. We have to be justified to take action. We can only talk about this with people who already agree with us. Those are the only conversations we can have. But in order to really make progress, we have to have conversations with people who disagree. Those are the only important conversations, as though white people who agree have nothing to gain from talking with other white people that agree with them, as though agreeing is the end of the work. we have to fix racism, and it's too big and too complicated to be fixable. And if I believe it's fixable, am I diminishing the problem? Am I pretending it's not as bad? This is I think there's a lot of overlap between the ideologies and stucknesses of anti-racism with climate change. There's a kind of stuckness or a giving up or being overwhelmed and then just stopping that happens with both of those. And finally, as white folks, we have to understand the experience of BIPOC folks in order to fix it. We can't really understand the experience of BIPOC folks. So there were lots of ways that these kids talked about being stuck. This is 4 out of about 12. It kept coming up. It kept coming up. Adjacent to this, we've got the stuckness talked about by these liberal-minded white folks. The backlash from more conservative-minded white folks has the same effect, in that it's a form of stuckness that I argue is informed by the same wounds, the same unhealed aspects of white people, and that if we address those wounds, both of these, they don't go away, but they become clear. They resolve into clarity. So we look at some of these elements of backlash as more liberal-minded folks, especially maybe in a church setting. You've got a congregation, you've got people you work with who can immediately become bitterly polarized. And our job is to come together so that the work of white backlash often has nothing to do with the actual backlashers. And I think the problem, the ideological problem at the root of that, is that people who are kind of responding to this, primarily, again, I'm addressing us here, assuming that we're not the ones doing the backlashing. But we might think that those backlashing ideas have some merit deep down. The problem is it's been the same backlash all the way back in our history. So for each of these things, it started way before we think it did. The first set of civil rights legislation was in the 1860s. And when you're like, oh yeah, the Civil War ended, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, people called that anti-white at the time. It's the same thing we talk about today. It doesn't make either of them right or wrong. The message is there's something at work that's resisting. And we have to understand what that resistance is about. We can't just try to convince people. Backlash was never about racial animosity. White backlash is never about white people trying to be racist, at least not functionally. White backlash is about white people trying to sustain themselves. Same with this Peter guy from Ohio. He's not going out hating people. He's, as he says, he's just trying to preserve what he has. Let's take him at his word and address that. There's a quote from the 60s about backlash. So I'm gonna read this quote, and it's from an Atlantic article. He noted that the backlashers, quote, are not against a better life for the Negro, but they are strongly against this being achieved at the cost of white tranquility, end quote. The elevation of tranquility over equal justice for all was a hallmark of backlash, which ranked white feelings over Black rights. So I would argue that while we think of that primarily as being a more conservative thing, of being the kind of those other white people, that's informed by the same emotional woundedness and fragility inherent to being white that we talked about with this stripping of ethnic resources. Here's a quote from James Baldwin. People cling to their hate so stubbornly. So he's talking about these violent backlashers. It's people cling to shame in the same way for the same reasons. People cling to guilt in the same way for the same reasons. And we cling to a belief in ourselves as good white people. And I believe some good white people, and we talked about this a little bit last time with empathy, good white people will undertake service work as a way to assuage that wound, that pain, of that initial wound of whiteness that divides that divides white people from people of color. That's an unnatural divide. It's a painful divide. Or the wound of becoming white, where our ethnic heritage, our resources, white resources, were stripped away in ways that they have not been stripped away from most communities of color, as Resmaa Menakem calls them, communities of culture. So what woundedness is driving these beliefs? What woundedness is underlying that hatred or that resistance or that shame or that guilt? And then how does it do? What does it do? How does it operate? So the status anxiety that working class white people, that drive working class white people in ways to Trump, to other Republican politicians who have used that, those racist dog whistles. That's not just Republican politicians. Bill Clinton championed the tough on crime laws in the 90s. So, but it has been primarily in the last 40 years, the political right. And then how is that, those same woundedness, how is that manifesting either as shame or as anger? All right, I'm going to pause here for a moment. Again, that's a lot. I'm looking at the chat. Jean, thank you. Is there any parallel in human DNA between whiteness in the US with Han Chinese in China? Human DNA. I think I would answer that this way. I don't know, I guess, is my first answer, but I think a different way of thinking about what I sense is within that question is an effort to understand the mechanisms of cultural supremacy, and that cultural supremacy is not limited to white people in North America, okay, or in Western Europe, I should start by saying. And yes, Japan for a long time was a colonialist power. There have been these cultural tensions, although when we look more recently, some what appear to be cultural tensions were manufactured by colonialism. Just as a historical note, in Rwanda, the Tutsis and the other group, sorry, that those groups were artificially designated by British colonial powers based on skin tone, that was an artificial divide that then became a very real cultural divide. Hutsi, thank you. Sorry, there are those divides internationally. That in a way that's a human thing. What happened in North America in particular was unique in a few specific ways. One was the ongoing intergenerational, the sustained what's called chattel slavery, and the durability and enforcement of whiteness, which is not an ethnic group. So while whiteness deals with ethnicity and race, what it functionally does is it tries to separate ethnicity. It tries to get rid of ethnicity and kind of assign it to people who are not white, which is yeah. And so I'll leave that there. There's Deb's question. Yes, 100%. Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, addresses three groups. What he calls white-bodied people, bodies of culture, and then police bodies. Yes, all are deeply wounded, all need to be healed, and in different ways. Okay. Other thoughts that are sort of bubbling around. I do have two more slides I could get to that I think might be useful, but we don't need to get to them, certainly. And I want to honor that this is, I think, a better way of interacting than me and slides. So I'll give a moment and then I'll go back to slides.
Felt like a threat.
Sorry.
Ask a question or more slides are coming. I'm just kidding.
They're not that bad, are they? Yeah, so Deb, would you mind coming off mute and talking about it a little bit? You don't have to.
She may have stepped away. Oh,
Okay.
I can figure out.
All right. So I'll
No, I'm off mute.
Oh, thank you.
This is Deb. I'm sorry. I'm not the most computer savvy, so just took me a minute. I guess as I was thinking about the wounded white and needing to heal from past historical issues. And I don't think there's a group in the United States that doesn't have historical wounds that they're carrying. And I guess, to be honest with you, my first thought was, it's like, okay, so the white people have to get healed first and then they can help the others get healed?
Oh,
Or,
yeah, good, great. Sorry, I'm interrupting.
and so it's like, how do we look at each other's wounds and our own and say, my wounds aren't your fault. Your wounds aren't necessarily my fault, but we all need to heal our wounds.
Yeah. Well, without getting into the fault side of things, which gets really messy.
Yeah.
I will say that it's my belief and the belief of a lot of scholars, it's not just me, that the problem of racism is a problem of white people. And if white people fix themselves, the need for the social inequities goes away. The need that white people feel I mean, on a very superficial note, cultural appropriation dramatically changes if white people are not wounded and stripped of an ethnicity. But more so than that, if white people are told over and over and over and over again that in order for white people to have more, other people have to have less, white people are going to resist policies that benefit people of color. If we lie to ourselves and say that social programs benefit people of color more than they benefit white people, which is not true, then we're going to oppose those policies. So the mechanisms of racial divide hurt everyone. And they only function to assuage white woundedness. They only function to soothe temporarily white woundedness. If white people are no longer wounded, the need for those policies go away. And what will change, as I'm forgetting which scholar said this, but white people will take the boot off of the neck of people of color. That might have been Malcolm X. The problem is it's white woundedness drives an ongoing investment in white supremacy. And white supremacy sustains that racial divide. It sustains falsely elevating some over others. And that shows up in very small and very large ways. So that the wounds sustained by BIPOC folks in the United States will happen less if, for one, white people no longer need to do them, and then two, white people recognize and remedy historical wounds. And that's obviously very much easier said than done.
Well, I was going to say, it's like that. I apologize for interrupting. I certainly can see how I'm only second generation American in my family. But I mean, even when my grandmother came over and from Sweden, and their names had to be changed, and their language was, they couldn't have their language. So I mean, I certainly understand that, and that I think I've worked hard to realize that there's only one race, and it's the human race, and you strip the skin off of us and we are all the same underneath. But how do we get the people who want to hang on to those wounds?
Short answer, I think while race is made up, it is also very real, and it does work. So we do a disservice to ourselves by pretending that it doesn't exist. And then I think secondly, the trick, and given more time, we would dig into this more. The trick isn't so much that there are other white people invested in this divide, so much as all white people sustain it. And then we have to understand how we sustain it and why we sustain it. But one of the first things Ellie and I focus on in our work is that it's us. It's me. It's Kevin. It's me. It's not somebody else. I'm living in the same society as David Duke and Donald Trump, and I'm as racist as the next person. My work is to understand the ways that I remain invested in that system, even as I try to work against it. So my using slides, my talking a lot, those are in a way white ways of being. It doesn't make them bad, but I have to be aware of that. We're out of time. But a major takeaway I would suggest, if nothing else goes through, is that there's no woke. There's only awakening. There's no point at which we arrive and are kind of good to go, and that we're not on a journey with some of us ahead of others. We're all personally working to grow as complex people, and we all have a lot of excavation and a lot of healing to do. And whenever I sit back and think, no, I'm kind of good, I'm doing all this work, I'm like, and someone says, well, what are you doing in your life that's not professional? Like, nothing. It's like, okay, I remain invested in those same structures. So that's a quick answer for you, Deb.
All right, thank you so much. I will mute myself.
Okay, folks, we're out of time. We want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much for showing up and how you showed up. We will be coming back next month with Yishan to do some inclusivity work with her. I'm so excited. I would love it if you'd be willing to drop a word in the chat as your one word check out. How you feeling? What is your body communicating to you as you move on to the next part of your day? Well, grateful, thoughtful, ready, enlivened, grateful, curious, introspective. Fantastic. And you can get our contact information from Jesse and Jane. We'd be so happy to stay in touch. I definitely recommend Kevin's book that you can kind of take in at your own pace. It's an amazing resource. Introspective, grateful, more informed, need to think in a quiet place. Yeah. Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much for showing up. Thank you for the quality of presence you brought to this group. We really appreciate it. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.